I'm Park Howell, and welcome to the Business of Story, where I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the applied science and bewitchery of brand and business storytelling, so that you can clarify your story to amplify your impact and simplify your life.
I thought it was just a stupid picture of a pig in the ocean. But after hearing that story, I had to have it. Now I wasn't just buying a picture. I was buying a story. Story literally made the picture worth more money to me.
That's what businesses are about. People buy brands. People buy stories much more than anything else.
I work with a lot of big enterprise companies, but let's just say I always tell folks, drop the PowerPoint, close your laptops, start with your story.
If you want people to get engaged and you want people to act, you have to tell them an emotionally powerful story. That's with great characters, it's with uncertain outcomes, and it's with high stakes and drama.
All business strategy is a story.
Well, if you've been listening to the Business of Story, then you know I've been talking about one of my bucket list speaker moments as of late. And that was my very first TEDx talk. I had the distinct pleasure back in March 24th of this year to be the anchor presentation in TEDxGilbert. And that was an opportunity that came through my work at Arizona State University in the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership program, where Glenda Wetton, my person that I reported to as an instructor professor there, connected me with today's guests to help get me on the show, to help get me into the TEDx program. And I got to tell you, it was so rewarding and it was so much work. You would have thought that, having taught and coached and consulted on storytelling for well over a decade now, that it would have come easy for me, but it didn't. And yet it was one of the most rewarding and educational, life-affirming, as they say. And I grew as a storyteller just by going through the process. So what I wanted to do today is bring to you the producer of TEDxGilbert, Jen Dille, who, by the way, this was the very first time she had done it. She had taken this project on with her daughter's best friend, and Jen's husband, and off they went. But it's so great to have her here. I want to give you a quick little background about Jen, because she was like the best host I could ever possibly imagine. And I think it's because she comes from such an eclectic background. So Jen wears many hats right now with different roles she's fulfilling. Her favorite is being a mom of 4 kids, 3 of whom who have left the house. So I know what it's like being an empty nester, and she's practically that empty nester. For her day job, she is a project manager for Sure Spark Marketing. She volunteers for Hope Arising, a nonprofit that takes dentists and volunteers to Ethiopia. Jen helped create and is now marketing a textbook with her husband, Brian, about Model United Nations. We'll have to learn more about that, about Model United Nations. In her spare time, Jen is the licensee and co-organizer of TEDxGilbert, and I asked Jen to come today to share her experience of producing their very first TEDx event. So if you are thinking about doing it, well, you're going to learn firsthand from Jen. Jen Dille, welcome to the Business of Story.
Thank you, Park. I'm so honored to be with you. This is going to be fun.
Oh, yeah, this is great. Well, I got to tell you, this was one of my best learning experiences for me I've had in a long, long time. And it came about, you were a big hand in that too, because I know when I gave you my very first script, you sent it back and you said, I like the big idea, but the rest of it's all muddled. And that's like, a death blow to a storyteller and a writer. But man, did I learn a lot when I went back to that. But we will get to that in a few minutes. Jen, tell us a little bit more about you, and why did you take on this event?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. Well, I've realized that as I am playing these different roles right now in my life, I was a stay-at-home mom for a while. And I feel like as my kids have gotten older, I'm like a kid in a candy store. Like there's so many neat and exciting things out there for me to be doing. And so as I've taken on one job and then I've heard about another job, I'm like, oh yeah, I can do that too. And then another volunteer experience, I'm like, yeah, let's do that. And then I'm working on this textbook with my my husband. I'm like, sure, let's throw that in. So what was funny is when Mara and I got approved to host, Mara is my daughter that I hosted the TEDxGilbert event with. When we got that approval email, both of us just looked at each other and we started crying because we realized, oh, this is going to be a lot of work. But we were so excited to do it and just jumped right in.
And that was about what, September of last year?
So that was actually in July.
July.
Yeah, 2017.
So I first heard from you all, I think around the September area time frame. So Mara was a senior in high school. Did she just graduate?
Yeah, so she just graduated this last May, and that's part of what drove our timing is that personally I thought, well, I'll just wait like 5 or so years to apply to host an event. And then we realized, well, wait, Mara wants to do it too. And with a little bit of self-interest, we're like, that would look great on a college resume to put that she was the co-organizer of a TEDx event. So we just decided, you know what, even though she's taking like 6 AP classes, let's just jump in and we'll do this. And yeah,
she's not an overachiever at all. Her and her best friend, I guess, Vanessa Straight, she was there.
Yes.
And I was so impressed with these two young ladies. They have this wisdom beyond their years. And I was surprised to learn that they were just in high school. So they are going to kill it in college.
Yes.
You also had some help from Ben Vining and Barb Farmer, two other folks in there that were helping out. And how did this all come about in the first place? You thought about doing it, but wasn't there this chance interaction in an airport across the country somewhere?
Yes, there were a few just amazing coincidences. So it all started when I read a book called TED Talks by Chris Anderson, and he's the CEO of the TED organization right now. And just in the intro, I didn't have a ton of time to read it, but I just read like the intro and the first few chapters. And in the intro, he talks about how all over the world, there's about 5 to 7 TEDx events on any given day, and that individuals can just apply for a license and the TED organization grants them. And so it is interesting because there's a main TED conference that's held in Vancouver once a year. And then they grant these licenses to individuals all around the world, and they can hold a TEDx event. And so it's an independent event. It usually reflects the name of the city. And so when I read that, I was like, hey, we should do that. We could really bring this to our community. And then my husband had taken some students to Washington, D.C., and their flight got delayed. So they were sitting in the airport, and he just started chatting with this nice woman who was sitting next to him. And it turns out that she has a business called Teach Like TED. And he said, oh, my wife's always wanted to do a TEDx event. And so they exchanged business cards. And so I contacted her.
That's Rachel
Her name
Mann.
is Rachel Mann. Yes. So she turned out to be our host and just a great resource. And we were able to have phone conference calls with her several times, like through the application process and after we got the approval. And she was just a great asset to us.
Well, I learned one of my favorite now and important storytelling tips from Rachel when she, in our rehearsal, told everybody that if you get up on stage and you start getting cotton mouth, and apparently TED doesn't like having you packing around water on stage, that if that happens, what you do as you're speaking, carve out a little section of your brain and imagine popping in a lemon drop, and that you now start sucking on your lemon drop. So folks listening right now, I want you to picture that lemon drop going in your mouth and what just happened.
Well, I'm doing it myself.
I am too. Saliva starts secreting.
Saliva.
And it worked for me because I went on stage at about 9 o'clock that night. It was a standing room only packed theater out in Gilbert, and it was warm. It got warm in that room, as it can in Arizona in spring. And by God, I got on there, and I had drunk so much water leading up to it that, Jen, I got up there, and a minute in, I'm like, my tongue felt like carpet. And I saw Rachel sitting over there, and I thought, lemon drop. And I popped that in my brain, and all of a sudden, like the plumbing went on in my mouth, and it was amazing. The other thing that amazes me about that is it also demonstrates the power of story, which, of course, my presentation was about, because I just had you picture a fictional story of you popping a lemon drop in your mouth. And even though you didn't actually pop a lemon drop in your mouth, you had a physical reaction to that request, to that story of popping it in. So to me, it was very, very meta, talking about story and
Yes.
demonstrating it in a simple little survival tool like that. I just loved it.
Yes, that is so handy. Rachel's wise in so many ways. And yes, the lemon drop is the takeaway for sure.
So your husband came back. The universe seems like it's starting to come together. You read Chris Anderson's TED Talks. You saw you could do a TEDx. You're thinking this might work. Your daughter was interested in doing this. Did you guys have a family huddle and then just finally said, that's it, we're going for it, knowing it was going to be a ton of work?
Yes. And Vanessa came on with us and was just so amazing. And so really, we would just meet at my kitchen table every Monday night and just start hashing stuff out. And, one of my biggest takeaways is that this task just felt so overwhelming. Like, I think we were smart enough to realize wow, okay, we're probably in a little bit over our heads, but we just started chipping away and chipping away. And one of my favorite Disney movies is Meet the Robinsons. And the main character, Lewis, has this theme, or he's taught this theme about just keep moving forward. And it's so simple, but yet it really is what got us through, is just keep moving forward. Just do what we can today.
What was it that hit you first that you thought, oh my goodness, we may have bit off more than we could chew?
Well, in the beginning, it did feel pretty simple. We just get speakers and everybody knows about TED, we thought, TED conferences. And so, of course, everybody's going to want to come to speak that we contact. And then you just find a venue and you sell some tickets. And then as we started digging into some of the rules and the way things work, and we were going to have to get event insurance and just some of these technicalities, that's when we started to realize oh, not everybody has heard of TED. And it's not just as simple as selling some tickets and finding a venue. Things just got kind of increasingly complex. So,
yeah, I found the same thing. I'm like you. I thought pretty much everybody was aware of at least TED and a group of those, of course, TEDx. But I've been surprised how many people aren't aware of even the TEDx, that I had to explain what that was. So that's always that kind of rude awakening. And then you started moving forward. When did you ever feel like you wanted to bail on it? Like, oh my goodness, we just can't pull this off.
Well, we got to the point where that was almost a daily occurrence. And my husband is even just a bright-eyed optimist. And there was one point where he was like, maybe we should just chalk this up as a nice idea. And it's funny because then I could switch seats at the table and be like, oh, no, we're going to make this work. It's good. And, I actually heard a podcast by a woman named Judy Moore. Her podcast is Better Than Happy. And she talked about how our brain functions to keep us alive. And so when we feel that feeling of overwhelm, then that's just our brain recognizing, okay, this task is going to take a lot of energy, and it tries to shut us down. Hey, yeah, a lot of energy. Let's not do that. But I realized that I had this mantra of hey, I can figure this out. I'm just going to chip away. And so once I could recognize that, I would just wake up and think, okay, well, what can I do today? And I started realizing that as long as I was putting my best effort in, then even though things were complex and felt overwhelming, I could be like, hey, we can do this just a little bit at a time.
So it's that whole concept of chunking, I guess, is you just go in and just take a little bit at a time and don't get overwhelmed and keep plugging forward.
Yep.
What then would be your advice if you got a couple pointers for our listeners, if they are just first taking on, what would be, if they're considering it, what are the 2 or 3 things they should really go in with eyes wide open?
That's a great question. Well, one thing that if they're going to do a TEDx event, you have to have someone on your committee who's been to a main TED conference. Otherwise, you are limited to 100 attendees at your event. And that was our case.
Do they do that just because you're fresh out of the box, you haven't been there, and they don't want, if it goes sideways, that they don't want to have too many people experience that going sideways?
I've combed through their rules so many times, and they've never offered an explanation. But my guess is that's what it is yes, they think, well, if you haven't seen the actual event, let's start you off with some training wheels and some baby steps here. And yes, because it does make sense.
Yeah. So did you guys go to a TED Talk then?
Well, so I was able to go to TED Fest, and that was in Brooklyn, New York. And that was in April after our event. So our event was limited to 100 attendees. So if someone's listening and they think, oh, I want to do a TEDx event, just know that if you are limited to 100 attendees, then you do kind of have to monitor how many volunteers you take on. So that kind of became an issue for us. Is we would have loved to have had a team of 45 or 50 people, which is kind of the normal for TEDx events because there are a lot of moving parts. And so we were really only able to have about 5 volunteers. Like you mentioned, Ben Vining and Barb Farmer, who are just amazing. We also had Meredith Reynolds, who helped us with the process. She's an English teacher. And so she would help edit talks. And so we did have to be very limited. So yeah, that would be my advice.
Were you disappointed that you couldn't have a bigger event, or was that okay considering it was your first one out of the blocks?
You know, in the very beginning, we thought, oh, only 100. And then, like I said, as it became more complex, we were like, wow, I'm so grateful that it's only 100 because there's a certain scale that you have to get to find your comfort. And 100 was good in the beginning.
So what'd you do next then? You're starting to chunk it. You know, you're now down limited to at least 100 people in the room, or 100 people. And you had some standing room there. So you might have pushed that number a little bit higher. It was packed and it was cool.
We did. Yeah. I have to say, we started reading some of the threads on this excuse me, TED Hub, where other TEDx organizers can come and share ideas. And so I realized, hey, do our volunteers count against us as far as attendees? And several people wrote back and said, no, they actually don't. You can account for those volunteers. And so that's where we started kind of push the envelope and go, okay, well, how about 110? How about 120? And luckily the TED police did not come that night.
So now, both you and I leaned a little bit on somebody who's done a number of these events, Tamsin Webster, who's been the producer of TEDx Cambridge for many, many years. And Tamsin has been on the Business of Story. In fact, she's show episode number 40, How to Craft Inspirational Stories. And I got to know Tamsin through the Business of Story. And I actually had her, I hired her to work with me and to go through her red thread process because I thought I was so close to my script, much like my dentist, Dr. Vo, he doesn't drill on his own teeth and do his own root canals. He goes to experts.
Yes.
And not that this was necessarily like having a root canal, although there were some similarities I found out that Tamsin helped me extract my overall theme and help frame my theme. And I used her red thread. And then I believe that she was kind enough to give you some time on the phone just so you could ask questions from a planning and producing standpoint.
Yes. And Tamsin was amazing, just so gracious to share her wisdom with me. And one tip that I got from her was to videotape our dress rehearsal. So our event was Saturday night. As you know, you said 9 p.m. You're up on the stage. And so we wanted to hold a dress rehearsal in the afternoon. So we did it, I think it was 1 to 3 or 2 to 4 or something like that. And so it was. I know. We put you guys through the ringer.
By the way, I didn't have Cottonmouth during the dress rehearsal. It only hit, at game time. So,
yeah. Of course. Yeah. So Tamsin's advice to video that was just so helpful because then I felt it could set you guys at ease. So then when we actually had the event, you could be like, hey, well, they already got a video out of this. So I'm fine. I can just have fun and do whatever, because that was one thing that we really wanted to have is just, we know it's a nerve-wracking process to speak at TEDx events. And so to have that fun and just anything we could do to kind of take that terror down a notch for you guys.
Well, and I think that's a really good point because I had never experienced that before, someone shooting something, in advance of a big presentation like that. And I got to admit it did. It took the pressure off because I thought, well, if I blow it here, at least they've got that first round. But then I think you also did something that really set all the presenters at ease. And you said, it's okay if you mess up. It's going to get edited. What goes up in the final piece will be edited and it'll be seamless. And you yourself have seen many other TED Talks from the TED stage where speakers actually say, wait, stop. No, I got to pick that up again. But, when you're there watching it from the audience real time, live, so it's a human experience. That stuff just happens. But what we all see online on TEDx and in the TED site are these perfectly coiffed presentations. But you were quick to tell us all, it's okay if you have to stop. It's okay if you forget. You can collect yourself and move on again. And I totally did not expect that. Completely did not expect that. And that really took the pressure off.
Yes. That is one of my favorite stories is on the Thursday before our event. My stomach was in knots. I was feeling so much pressure. And I thought, wait, this really isn't how it's supposed to be. I mean, I can be nervous and I can feel some of those jitters that are really excitement masquerading as nervousness. And luckily, my son, who's away at college, was able to attend a different TEDx event. And I haven't asked their permission for this story, so maybe I won't name them. But he said it was very interesting because the first speaker made a mistake and she had to stop. And he said you could just feel the tension in the audience and like, oh, shoot, what is she going to do now? And then the MC came up and explained to them, hey, this is kind of like a taping of the Ellen show. This is not what's going to go up on our website. Thanks to the magic of video editing, it's going to look seamless. And he said that just completely shifted the tone in the room. And he said every other speaker made mistakes. And he said one was to the point where this guy put his hand to his head and just looked down. And you could tell he just completely lost his train of thought. And someone in the audience yelled, "You got this, Bob." And everybody started cheering. And he said it was just this really great group energy that everybody was in the audience was rallying around the speaker. And it just made all the difference. And so I was so grateful that my son Hayden had that experience on Thursday night, because then that was able to just kind of shift our focus. And then we could tell you at that Saturday dress rehearsal, just what you said, hey, let's just have fun with this. And so that just was the hugest mental shift for me. And I'm glad it was for you too.
It really was. It took the pressure off. And I got to say, you and your family did such a beautiful job of just embracing all the speakers and the volunteers that literally it felt like we were there at kind of a family gathering. And it was like family skit night with the Dillies. But very professionally produced. The stage was beautifully done. And I will say, of all the presentations, and you had Jen Daniels, the mayor of Gilbert, speaking, Joe Johnston, a very big time entrepreneur and restaurateur in Phoenix area, especially out in Gilbert, Chet Jenkins, Katie McPherson, an educator, and I don't want to butcher this name, Shivant Shrivastava. Did I even get that close?
Great job.
A young, brilliant mind from the youth community leader down in Tucson. And everybody got up and they gave their presentations and not one of them bobbled. You know what I mean? There wasn't anybody that said, wait, I got to stop over or start over. I got to stop over. I got to start over. Or I forgot where I am. They all flowed. And I think the reason why is you simply took the pressure off of them, saying it's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect. And as a matter of fact, we're not expecting it to.
Yes, that was one of the hugest surprises to me is I was ready to people to bobble and have mistakes and stop and start. And we just made life so easy for our video editor because all 6 of you were just amazing. I don't know that he had to do very much editing at all.
Yeah, it was great. And I've also heard horror stories that if you go over 18 minutes, you get the big TED hook and they yank you off. And luckily that didn't happen to any of us either. I think I might have gone on a little bit longer because, boy, that speech spreads out a little bit when you are on stage, and you add a little bit more pause for drama. And as Tamsin said, if you're going to do an 18-minute presentation, write a 16-minute presentation, and it somehow finds its way to 18.
It's true. It's like an elastic waistband. Yes.
Well, the other thing too, when I first started working with Tamsin, her red thread method, she said, Park, how long is your presentation? I said, well, aren't they all 18 minutes? And she goes, no. For your very first one, go between 9 and 12. Just write a 9 to 12, get in, get up, get out, done. So the very first one I wrote was, roughly about 10 and a half minutes, maybe that. And you and I started talking about it, sent it out to you. You had some corrections, rightly so, like start over, like your idea, but start the whole dang thing over. And oh, by the way, we want you to be the anchor, number 6 in all of this. And we would really like to get an 18-minute presentation out of you. So I was like, Oh my goodness, I got to start over and add another 8 minutes to, are you kidding me? Tamsin's going to kill me.
I know we were so rough on you, but you were great. You're really wise, Park. And so we wanted to hear you for as long as we could.
But let me ask you, what was the hardest thing that you had to do with TED? What maybe surprised you that was really difficult pulling this off that you had to get through?
That is such a good question. I would say the hard part or the surprise was how hard it was because, I mean, like I said, you think, okay, we just get 6 speakers and find a venue and everybody's going to want to come. So I know that's probably not a very original surprise, but yeah, just the complexity of things. And I kind of felt like I'm a pretty organized person. And so I thought if I can stay organized, if we can have processes, if we can be communicating well, then I can really make it so that we're not going to run into as many problems as maybe an unorganized person would. And so that's what just kept surprising me is like, wait, why do we keep having these problems? I'm organized. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, it sounds really naive, but just talking with other people, I just learned that anytime you have an event, anytime you're involving the public, it just gets, and this is actually one of the mantras that I share with my husband when he's so optimistic and he's ready to take on more things. Everything is more complicated than you think it's going to be.
Isn't that the truth?
Yes,
Don't let that keep you from doing it.
It's true.
So,
yes.
I mean, you have this beautiful website at TEDxGilbert.com. I mean, even that, you had to go out and track down a web designer and creator who presumably gifted this to you or got paid very little money. So you have to cajole folks like that into helping you make this nonprofit happen.
Yes. You know, Matthew with Kill Disco Design, he has been absolutely amazing. Just a dream to work with. And so that was my commitment to him is I will try to spread the word. And he's just been fantastic to work with. So yeah, just all these little pieces to the puzzle that you just don't really think of.
Let's give him a little bit more promotion. Matthew, what's his last name?
You know, it's Welsh Weinberger and his company is Kill Disco Design.
Kill Disco.
Isn't that great? So here's a funny story for you.
Uh-huh.
I found him, I was just putting out a call like, hey, I need some help with TEDxGilbert on the Nextdoor app that's intended to bring people together. And so he replied right away and we've worked together just super well. We talked on the phone a few times. And then after the event, I said, hey, Matthew, I need to send you a thank you card. What's your address? And he gave it to me and I just about fainted. He lives 2/3 of a mile away from me and I never knew it. So he's my neighbor. I didn't even know.
Well, Katie McPherson, one of the presenters, the educator, her talk was about be the mayor of your 5-mile radius, be in control of your 5-mile radius. So there you are. As your mayor, you now have a subject in Matthew that you connect with.
Yes.
Well, that was a great thing about the TEDxGilbert too, is your theme, identity, where have you been, where you're going. I thought that was a really fun and interesting program to work from. And again, when I started working with Tamsin on this, explaining to her, what the theme was and what I thought I wanted to do, this whole idea of stop looking for your big story, start finding your scenes, those moments that have shaped who you are today, knit those scenes together, and now your authentic story will find you. And that's the story to live into. So it worked really well. But she asked me, and I thought this was really important, and I'm curious if you thought about this too. Tamsin asked, who are you for? Who are you for, Park? Who is this message for? And I thought about you and your daughter and the young people that were pulling off this event, and I said, I'm assuming this is going to be a room full of 20-somethings, high schoolers and 20-somethings, with some, older folks in there, older professionals, but for the most part, I said, I really want to be for that 20-something person out there who is still trying to find their way, especially when they're distracted with social media and all these other things, where they can start living into other people's stories or start, just being a fictional character in their own story. And I wanted them to find their story to be their best non-fictional self. So I said, I am for that 20-year-old, that 20-something in there so that they can start looking for their scenes to knit together their story. Did that come into mind when you guys were putting this together? Who is your audience for this?
Yes, we definitely had that in the forefront of our mind. And as we would meet with potential sponsors, they would ask that a lot. And one thing that we were really grateful for is two of our sponsors felt so passionately about that they even sponsored tickets for veterans and students. And so they just really wanted to make sure that people who wanted to be there that maybe couldn't afford it were able to attend. And that was something that was always, always in the forefront of our mind. And so we were really grateful to Board Developer and Joshua Development and Rayhan's Financial Solutions that sponsored those tickets for those people and really were able to make sure that we had a diverse crowd there that night. Because we did want to make sure that we're speaking to the community at large and not just our friends and family, because that was one thing about the 100 attendee limit is by the time we thought of like all our friends and family, it was like, okay, wait, that's like 3/4 of the room already filled. We can't do that. And so we really did need to be careful. And one thing that was really gratifying is we got a lot of feedback after we got a note from a teenage girl and just different people that I spoke with that said, I was feeling kind of like I was in a rut and kind of down on the dumps. And when I came to TEDxGilbert, I just felt so revitalized. And that whole theme of just be who you are just really resonated with people and really gave them a renewed desire to figure out who they are and to be that person and not just put on a shiny face for Instagram and social media. And so we just felt really gratified that your message and everybody's message that night really reached our intended audience.
Did it take you very long to come up with that theme, or did you have kind of that family and friends huddle and said, what is this going to be about?
We bantered it around for a while. It's so funny how it just, with hindsight, it felt like it just all came together so clearly. But I do remember a few times where we were considering like, okay, is that really what we want? But when we would kind of try on different themes, we were like, no, that doesn't really fit. That doesn't fit. And we feel like Gilbert has such a diverse community and it's changed so much even in the last 10, 20, 30 years, especially 50 years. It used to be the alfalfa capital of the country. And now just, tons of families from all over. And we really were trying to reflect that diversity.
Yeah, in the downtown area, it still has that sort of old cowboy farmer feel, yet it has such amazing restaurants and boutiques and microbreweries. It's grown so fast, and the theater you had it in was absolutely beautiful. So it was fun to reach out to sort of the outskirts, outside of, proper Phoenix, and get out, in Maricopa County, a little bit farther out with groups. And it was fun. I would say when I was looking at that audience, am I correct in thinking about 70, 75% of them were in that 20-something range and the others were older professionals?
That's a good question. We didn't have any demographic questions on our tickets, so I'm not sure. I know we did put those students in the front row. Mm-hmm. So maybe as those lights were blinding you, like that was basically who you were seeing in the front. I know I did feel like there was a good representation of age groups. So they might have been a little bit more in the back. So and I had so many things going in my head that night that, I didn't exactly count like, okay, who's in what age group? But we really did want to reach out to all ages and make this universal, because one thing we did consider and we were asked is that question that Tamsin asked, who are you for? Who is your audience? Is it just Gilbert? And we realized that one of the great benefits of living in 2018 is these talks are going to be on YouTube. And so they can be watched from people all over the world. And so while we did want to touch on the issues that are facing Gilbert, we didn't want to make it a Gilbert only event, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely does. So final round of questioning for you. In coaching speakers, what did you learn in that process? And what did you find were some of the best tips that you all gave to get the presentations where you felt they needed to be for TEDxGilbert?
Oh, that is such an interesting question. So I feel like I went into this process thinking that there's kind of a classic formula for a TED Talk. I mean, a lot of them are famous. Most people have heard at least one. And so I thought, yeah, it's pretty obvious what a TED Talk is. But as I worked with each of the 6 of you, and I also really made an effort to reach out to other TEDx organizers, I learned that there's really not a formula for a TED Talk. And even when I was able to attend TED Fest in Brooklyn, that is one thing that as I would meet new people and talk to them and share ideas, that was my number one question is, to you, what constitutes a TED Talk? And over, I got the answer. It's an idea worth spreading. And that's the tagline for TED, ideas worth spreading. And so I realized that people's ideas can come in all sorts of packages. And so while I'm accustomed to kind of the formula of start with a teaser story, like I loved your intro story. I still remember that one, and present some information that's new, and, just kind of that formula that you kind of get used to when you've listened to as many TED Talks as I have. So just trying to recognize that people can present their idea in their own packaging, but still trying to keep it an interesting idea and keep it flowing. So to answer your other question as far as tips, really just making sure that each speaker's voice comes through. And that was one thing that was so interesting, is that I felt like I just wanted to be all of your friends. And so I did feel like a bit of an English teacher with the red pen just hacking away at your talk. But I realized, well, the greater good here is to have a good talk where we can hear like the essence of Park Howell's idea, and really making sure that that's coming through clearly. So I don't know. I don't know that I have like a takeaway tip, but just making sure, because each of the 6 of you was so individual, but I did feel like we got to the point where I could just hear your talk and go, yes, that's Park Howell. Yes, that's Jen Daniels. And just really making sure that your voice is coming through, if that makes sense. It does.
And so we had 6 very diverse speakers there. Is there one or two things you saw that the mistake or a misstep or something that we all did that we had to correct or overcome to make our presentations even stronger?
Probably just condensing down. Like, I mean, you and I talked when we spoke on the phone, I think it was in February, that it's almost easier to make a 45-minute talk than it is to make a 16-minute talk. And so just that process of condensing down. And plus, I feel like once you've started on that process of preparing your talk, like you've alluded to, you get kind of emotionally attached to just about everything in your talk. And so it's almost like a grieving process to drop a paragraph or to even drop part of your idea. And like,
it's like losing a limb. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yes. I love this thought, but it's really just not as relevant to the overall idea. And so I guess my tip would be just being able to recognize that emotional attachment and, okay, why are you so emotionally attached to it? And if it really is that hard, okay, well, do we need to then shift the focus to that idea? So I feel like so maybe a tip would be, we started really early. Like we had deadlines and we were requiring drafts like back in December, and the event was in March. And so I feel like that having that much time gave us the freedom to be able to say, okay, we need to chop part of this and let's condense it down even further and have that give and take so that we have that time for the refining process, because it really is an emotional process that you have to let it percolate.
Oh, you got that right. And I learned so much from it. As I mentioned at the top of the show, that I wrote a post, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes, called What My TEDx Talk Taught Me About Storytelling. And I did learn a ton in the process. And what I'd like to do as we just close out here with you, Jen, is I'm going to share my TED Talk after we're done here, so that people, if they haven't seen it, at least they can listen to it, and would love to get their feedback. And of course, you can go over to businessofstory.com, look at my post, because I wrote essentially an instructional post of here's what I learned, and here's how my story came together, and here's how I ended up using my ultimate story cycle system to outline and be the framework for my final presentation, where Tamsin and her red thread really helped me focus and frame my message to get it crystal clear. I went through her process, which really was like doing a trick of my brain and getting all the, the content in there and starting to boil it down. Got your input. And then I ultimately went back to what I knew, and that was my story cycle system. And so I took all of that brilliant coaching from Tamsin, dropped it back into my framework, and ended up with what I've got today. And I'm very proud of it. And I really want to thank you, Jen, not only for having me, but for your coaching and your guidance and your compassion and all that. I mean, you and your family blew me and the other speakers away of what a brilliant job you did with it. Like I said, it felt like a family skit night done very, very professionally because there was no pressure. Once we were there, it was like everyone is for everyone. And I just thought you did a brilliant job with it.
Oh, thanks. Well, and I really wanted to say that one thing that I appreciated about you, we can have a little mutual admiration society going here, is that you were very humble. And I feel like you could have come in and said, look, lady, I know what I'm doing. I do storytelling professionally. I got this. But I never had any sense of that from you at all. And even when I could tell you were deflated and disappointed, when I said, hey, your message isn't clear here, you were very humble. So I guess that's another tip, is that if you are going to go through this process, either as an organizer or a speaker, you really do have to have an element of humility, because it's just crucial to getting through this process and being able to refine and change and get other people's feedback. So you did a great job of just accepting feedback. And really that's hard to do because you know a lot. This is your profession and you're very good at it.
Well, thank you. And I think, yeah, it hurt, but you have to have some humility because you were only trying to make it better, and you did make it better. Because I was too close to it. I was Dr. Vo drilling on my own teeth in some cases. I needed someone else. I wanted to give one more shout out in addition to Tamsin is Lisa Rothstein of drawingoutyourgenius.com. She did this really beautiful, cool little drawing of my entire talk for me. I hired her to do that, and I did it for a couple different reasons. And so this would be a tip for you speakers out there, is I never memorize anything. But here was a brand new talk that I had to get my head around and memorize it because I wasn't going to really have any prompts in front of me. So 18 minutes of this fairly new content. And what I did is she came in and drew this great illustration. Again, we'll have it within the show notes. And it took my talk from my very first scene, my very first story, all the way through the story cycle with all the different elements in it to my concluding, closing ask of the audience. And so what I was able to do with that is I've got it. And it gave me a visual way to memorize my presentation. Plus, I now have a handout and a PDF that you can download that takes you through the whole presentation. So again, hats off to Lisa. She did a brilliant job over at drawingoutyourgenius.com. And then the one other tip I would give that helped me a lot is I recorded my presentation. Once I finally had it past the Jen muster and I knew it was going to be okay and she wasn't going to throw me off stage, that I just got on this mic right here and I recorded it, edited it, just so I could listen to it. And then I would go hike my dog Hazel and we would go into the foothills around Phoenix and I would put that on and I would listen to my presentation 2 or 3 or 4 times, depending on how long my hike was. And I felt that combination between the visual ability to memorize my story and then hearing it myself really helped me when I got on stage. And in fact, my wife, who couldn't be at TEDx because she was at a wedding for very, very good friends of ours, when she watched it, she's like, oh my gosh, you really had that dialed in. Lots of practice, but a couple little memorization techniques for you listening if you want some help in trying to, put together a presentation and memorize it.
Yes, I think that's a great idea. And, a funny story is Chet was telling me that he did the same thing because we were able to share that idea with the other speakers since you told us you were going to be recording yourself. So Chet did that and would practice giving his speech and listening to his speech when he was driving to work. He said he realized the gas light came on and he had totally spaced that he was almost out of gas because he was so focused on his talk while he was driving. So just be careful when you're driving.
His own little in-car moment, like NPR, when you get so enthralled in something that you forget where you are and that you're running out of gas. Well,
Yes.
Jen,
it's
thank you
true.
so much for being here. Any last words of wisdom? Because I know you are getting ready for Gilbert, TEDxGilbert #2 next year.
Yes, we are excited about TEDxGilbert 2019. We're starting to plan that. So, I guess just lessons that I've learned is reach out to that network that you have, because that was one thing that I loved, was just meeting people. Like I said, with Matthew, who lived so close to me and I didn't even realize it, but I just feel like it really got me out of my little bubble that I live in. And so to realize how many amazing people are in our community that I can work with and care about sharing ideas, it was just really, it sounds cheesy, but it was life affirming. Like, wow, there's good people around here that are excited about ideas. And there's just so many good resources. Like, I really tapped into the other TEDx organizers. There's that hub. There's actually a podcast called Hacking the Red Circle that's intended to help TEDx organizers, because a lot of people have been doing this for years. And there's more and more novices like myself who are just learning. And so they're so gracious to be able to share and help. And I really appreciate the scenes that you had that helped me define my story. And so I've actually applied your talk, and it's really helped me get a better sense of who I am. So I would just encourage everybody to do that practice that you talk about in your TED Talk, because it really has helped me craft my story. So thanks for the things that you've shared with me and with everyone.
Well, that makes it all worth it right there. So thank you, Jen. And folks, if you want to listen on, I will share my TED Talk with you here in just a moment. And Jen, thank you so much for being a part of the business of story and doing what you're doing with TEDxGilbert. I'm looking forward to being a coach working with you next year.
Yes.
And helping some of your other presenters come on board and to kill it the way all my fellow presenters did this past March. So thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you for having me, and we'll look forward to having you as a coach. That'll be great.
Looking forward to it. And folks, here we go. I'm going to share with you my TEDx. And by the way, at the end of it is an exercise for you to go out and start finding your scenes. So listen in, find your scenes, pull your story together, and then let me know how it worked for you. Thanks for listening. I'm honored to be here with you. And I got to start with a wonderful woman that I know who is going to turn 93 years old on April 5th. 89 years ago, when she was 4 years old, she was sitting in a cold and kind of scary waiting room in a hospital in Wenatchee, Washington. She was waiting for the arrival of her sister, Diane. And as she was sitting there, out of nowhere comes this nurse, just kind of appears in all of her beautiful nurse whites, kind of like a guardian angel. And she sat down with Pat and she chatted with her, eased her a little bit. And then she reached in her pocket and she pulled out and gave Pat an orange. Pat never forgot that. In fact, it was such a profound moment in her life that she too went on to become a nurse. After World War II, she studied, practiced. She was over in Hawaii. And then she met her husband, Keith, and got married at 29. Now, back in that generation, getting married at 29 and starting a family is kind of late, so she wasted no time and had 7 kids in 9 years. Yeah. And if you want to know if God has a sense of humor, he put her in charge of the sex ed program at her kids' school at St. Brendan's in Bothell, Washington. Makes sense, doesn't it? Well, after her brood had grown and gone, Pat went back into nursing, and she volunteered for nearly 3 decades at Overlake Hospital in Bellevue. Till most recently, when she's been attending to her husband, Keith, of 65 years, who's been battling Alzheimer's. So a pretty amazing run. And when I sat down with her and I asked her, over 70 years, all of the people that you have touched, she told me it was because of that single stranger, that nurse that showed up that morning and gave her an orange. And when she got that orange, she knew that that was her calling in life. She would be a nurse. So I learned that we are so busy looking for these big stories in our life that it's not big stories of love and loss that defines who we are and where we're going, but those scenes, those simple moments that have shaped who we are today. Now, I learned this starting really back in 2006 when I started headlong into studying the applied science and bewitchery of storytelling. See, leading up to this, I'd been in the advertising and marketing world for 20 years. And I was starting to see, because of technology, that where brands used to own the influence of mass media, the masses became the media. They owned the narrative, and they created a cacophony of communication. You know how hard it is now to stand out, to rise above the noise, to be heard, or to even be identified for that matter. Well, our clients were feeling the same way, so I had to go and find an answer. And what I learned in that search is that an anecdote is the antidote. The human mind yields helplessly to the suction of story. Jonathan Gottschall wrote that in his amazing book called The Storytelling Animal, Why Stories Make Us Human. Think about it, storytelling is probably the single most powerful evolutionary tool we have. Stories literally have evolved us from cavemen and women to consumers. It's how we make meaning out of the madness of being human beings. Science now is really studying this and trying to figure out exactly how does story work on our brains and our bodies. And they will do the functional magnetic imaging, and they will look and they will see where your brain lights up when you're listening to a story, and your brain actually thinks you are an active participant in that story. Kind of crazy. Blood tests show that a great story can release up to 5 different neurotransmitters. They include serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, cortisol, and endorphins. When I was invited to come and give this presentation, I was pumped. In fact, my brain was filled with serotonin because I felt wanted, I felt important, and it just made me happy. Too little serotonin in our lives actually depresses us. So I was so proud of my first script. Sent it in, strutting around saying, this is going to be awesome. Until I came back and said, you know what, this needs a lot of work. Good idea, but it's kind of buried in here, so I think you need to get back after it. Well, I can tell you my cortisol pump jumped into speed right there, giving me the focus I need to fight through that. And then when I was writing it in my 11th hour and trying to get it done in time, well, that's when the endorphins kicked in. Gave me my second win to get through, and ultimately the euphoria of overcoming this challenge. To me, storytelling is like rocket fuel. It literally ignites these volatile neuropropellants in our brains that transports us from one world to another. Ira Glass of This American Life talks about an anecdote having a momentum all itself. He says that even if you have a story with boring facts in it, if it's a well-told story, it feels like you were on a train to a destination. It has this amazing momentum. But here's the challenge. We are implored to be telling our stories all the time. And so often we think about the Ira Glass scale stories and we think ours don't measure up. Well, here's the disruption I want you to be thinking about. Stop thinking about your story and start finding your scenes, those moments that have shaped who you are today. Because in those moments, you're going to find your superpower. This was underscored to me a couple weeks ago when I met an amazing lady. Her name was Angela Crow, a Ukrainian immigrant. She works for a very fast-paced, high-tech company out of New York that happened to be here in Arizona for their annual conference. And I had the good fortune of taking them through a storytelling program for half a day. Well, Angela got up. She volunteered to tell us her story. She was so proud. She sat there and she said, you know, my sole purpose here at this company is to build alliances and partnerships, and I'm really good at it, and they're really important. So I was coaching her in front of 60 of her colleagues. I said, that's great, Angela, but can you take us to a moment when you knew that this was one of your superpowers? Well, she kind of looked over at me, and she kind of actually physically moved away, and I knew she wasn't into telling us what that moment was. And I thought, well, maybe it's because she's in front of all of her colleagues, or maybe it was just a really sad time in her life and she just didn't want to share it in public. We wrapped up the session, and Angela came up to me afterwards and she said, you know, Park, I didn't tell you the whole story. I said, yeah, I know. Why is that? She goes, well, I've been told here in America that nobody wants to hear about the hard times I had in the orphanage. I said, orphanage? You grew up in a Ukrainian orphanage? She said, yeah, born there, raised there till I was 18. It was tough. People picked on me. I got abused. I said, oh my God, how did you cope? She goes, well, I remember one morning waking up. I can't remember if I was 8 or 9, but I realized if I was going to survive this, that I had to surround myself only with the kids that I could trust. And I actually had to look for the adults that not only cared for me, but it cared about me. And I said, oh my God, you literally have been building alliances and partnerships ever since you were a little girl. She goes, I had to. It was the only way I could survive. Well, then I learned about Angela that when she got out of there at 18, she came to America. She went to the University of Georgia in Atlanta, got 2 degrees, then went on to Georgia State and earned her MBA in international business, and has had a pretty stellar technology career ever since. And she's probably only 35. And I told her, I said, Angela, you absolutely have to tell your story. You are the epitome of the American dream. Rags to riches. Immigrant comes to town, works hard, and achieves something. And it all started in that moment when you realized that building alliances and partnerships was a real superpower of yours. All back in this day in a Ukrainian orphanage. Well, she looked at me and she said, thank you. And I think it was the first time she's ever gotten permission to tell that story. And I asked her, may I have your permission to tell your story tonight at this event? And you know what Angela said to me? Absolutely. That is the power of the moments and the scenes in all of our lives. Stop looking for the stories and start finding the scenes that have shaped who you are. But when you do, you become literally the protagonist, the center of your story. And like every protagonist in every story, when they reach to try to do something, when they try to get out of status quo, the universe is going to push back. It's going to punch you in the nose. It's going to want to test your character just to see if you're up to the task. How badly do you really want it? The universe has quite a powerful platform out there in this day and age called social media, where it seems like everybody's running around in fiction. Think about it. Every time you post something, you get that little like button. That is the opioid pusher of the web. Serotonin, dopamine, endorphins flood into us and we love it. So what do? We put our happy faces out there all the time, even when we're feeling sad. It's inauthentic to us. And then what else do? FOMO, the fear of missing out. How often have you been that fawning voyeur to someone else's grand adventure, feeling like yours don't really quite measure up? And then perhaps the greatest personal mistake we make with our narrative is we compare what we think are our simple little stories to everybody else's epic fictions. That doesn't work for us very well either, because it feels inauthentic to us. Being connected to people in our lives is essential for our sanity and for our survival. But what do? We try to overconnect sometimes, and we start living into other people's lives, playing roles in those lives, living into their stories on their terms, all trying to connect. But what does this do to us? Quite often we feel like it's inauthentic. We feel unworthy, alienated, and lonely. And really one of the biggest things that happens when we start living to other people's lives is we lose confidence in ourselves because we are trying to measure up to their expectations. I can tell you the day the universe came calling and gave me a wake up. Monday, September 14th, 2015. I woke up with a knot in my stomach because I knew I was going to have to make a major change. You see, I had been in the advertising world, as I mentioned. I've been running an agency for 20 years. Now, it's something that I've worked at tirelessly. We started in a little shack behind our very first home. It grew. We added lots of employees. We built a building. And I created a company I thought that defined me. And I had a good time for a while doing that because I thought I was also building a career that my mom and dad would be proud of, that my siblings would appreciate, and even my peers would respect. But you know what? I wasn't happy because I just wasn't living into my own story. The answer was sitting right before me, right plain sight. In fact, I've been preaching and teaching it for many years, and it comes back to this idea of story. We have been helping brands around the world create their brand story strategy to make their impact. We had so much success in this area, it was almost started to get out of our advertising realm that Arizona State University called 5 years ago and said, Park, we're pretty fascinated with what you guys are doing with this. Would you mind writing a curriculum for the Executive Masters for Sustainability Leadership in Communications based on your story cycle system? Which I did, and then I had the distinct honor of teaching for 4 years. I mean, I got to work with executives around the world. So here comes the universe. Wakes up and he says, dude, what are you doing? You have to get out of this advertising world and start doing this over here. And I'm like, this is a major pivot. For a dude at 55, midlife, that's tough, but I knew I had to do it. So now what I did, jumped in with both feet. I consult, teach, coach, and speak on the power of story to folks just like you to help you find your personal narrative so that you can go out and make the most profound impact in the world on your terms. All compelling stories starts in the moment. Moments are the experiences that are all unique to us. Those experiences then lead to our beliefs. The beliefs lead to our personal truths. When we unwrap those truths, we find our absolute gifts that we bring to this world, our superpowers. Now, it may not look like this guy, but that's the metaphor that I want you to take away. What is your superpower that you could nudge the world in any direction you choose by living in and embracing the scenes and the moments in your life that make you uniquely you? Now, here's the toughest part about this whole storytelling scene thing. Hollywood calls it the dark night of the soul. I kind of prefer the belly of the whale. I know someone who might call it Ukrainian orphanage. But it is in our moments of struggle, when the universe is putting the screws to you and your character, that you will probably find your most compelling, pivotal scenes in your life that actually propel your stories forward. But like an archaeologist, you have to go and dig them up. They're often hidden under the detritus of life, or they don't immediately come to our recall because they're unpleasant, or they're buried underneath the piles of scripts that people think that we need to be playing to. Let me give you an example. I'm going to take you to a kitchen. There's a 9-year-old boy there named James, and he's hanging out with his aunt. His aunt's drinking some tea, and James is absolutely fascinated by this tea kettle on the stove that is still boiling away and spewing out steam out of the spout. So much so he gets up on a chair, he has a spoon, he holds it over, he watches the condensation build up, he watches the drops of water come off, and he is just blown away by this phenomenon that he's trying to figure out. Well, James's aunt is pissed. She thinks he's idling away, messing around, lazy, yells at him, "James, why don't you get down and go do something? Read a book. Do something productive for a change. Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" How do you think James felt? Have you ever had anyone say that to you because he just misunderstood who you are and what you're up to? Well, thank goodness for us that James went on undaunted, because 20 years later, in 1765, at the age of 29, James Watt created a kind of steam engine that ushered in the Industrial Revolution, a momentous time that all started with a moment at a teapot. Now, what TED Talk would be complete without a reference to Steve Jobs? When he was a student at Reed College in Portland, Oregon, he was taking a calligraphy class, and people were saying, "Steve, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time and money doing this?" But what did his fascination lead to? The graphical design, Apple computer, and a complete revolution in how we compute. So you see, even revolutions begin in moments of discovery and inspiration. So what are your scenes? What are your moments? Stop looking for the big story and find out those moments that absolutely define who you are. When you do, wonderful things happen. You will begin to clarify your origin story. So people will have a better understanding of who you are, what you're about, where you come from, and where you are going. It starts creating real empathy. With that empathy, then, you start amplifying your impact, because you get to share your real-world experiences with those close to you. They get to experience it to connect your shared beliefs and values. And then finally, what it does for you, it simply helps you simplify your life, because you just get to be you. Here's what I want you to do tonight. Before you go to bed, pull out a pen and a paper and write down on that time when. Those 3 words will lead you to an amazing place. And answer questions like this. Any questions you want that get you to that moment, that time when your curiosity took you down a path that surprised you and literally changed the course of your life. Or that time when a seemingly insignificant moment had a surprising impact on you. Or that time when you overcame something you thought you could never do. So I want to ask you, what is your enlightened calligraphy moment? What is your inspired teapot incident? What is your episode of being abandoned and feeling lonely? Or, like my mom Nurse Howell, what is that symbolic orange in your life that inspired your purpose? Then in the morning, knit those things together. And you never know, you might even have the universe there knocking on your door, get a little pit in your stomach, changing your course. Regardless of what happens, I promise you will learn what I have learned, that the most potent story you will ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a great one. Thank you.